Russia will need 5 years to conquer the rest of Donbas, believes one of the major well-connected mill bloggers, and outlines 3 scenarios, all of which are bad for Russia. Another Russian mill blogger even believes that the Russians are facing a defeat like in 2022, but this time even worse. Holy smokes! Now save the most at Holy with my code. At the start of the full invasion, Russia had already occupied about a third of Donetsk and Luhansk. In the 4 years of war since then, Russia has managed to capture almost all of Luhansk. However, about 15 to 17% of Donetsk is still under Ukrainian control. This includes the fortress belt with the cities of Kostiantynivka, Drushkivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk. Putin is demanding the surrender of this area for a ceasefire. That is the result. Many of the negotiation rounds with the Americans, and that is his minimum demand that he is making to the Ukrainians. For the Ukrainians, this is actually out of the question. In the remaining area, it's not just the home of over 300,000 Ukrainians. There are also the crucial urban and logistical anchors of the Ukrainian defense in the northern and western Donetsk region. The area has been fortified since 2014 and is considered extremely difficult to capture, especially since the dense settlements give the defenders enormous advantages. The important fortress belts, which are currently stopping the Russian advance, also run through this area. The area is also economically important because of its industry, its mines, and the defense industry, especially in Kramatorsk. In addition, it is of enormous political importance because it prevents Russia from declaring even a partial victory. As long as the Ukrainians still control part of Donetsk, the Russian puppet regimes, the so-called People's Republics, still cannot fully control the territory they claim, have authority, which means the Russians cannot even declare this partial victory. So while the conquest of all of Donetsk is the highest priority for the Russians, the Russian military blogger Fighter Bomber is pessimistic, despite all the repeated claims of Russian troop superiority. He sees only 3 options. First, an offensive following the current model. The first option is to continue the slow offensive with varying degrees of success, regardless of the losses, which, to put it mildly, will be very high. At the current slow pace, that will take at least 5 years. We can speed up the process a bit by throwing everything we have left in terms of combat equipment and aircraft into the battle. And if we do this competently and effectively, we can liberate those 15% with roughly equally heavy losses in personnel, but also in equipment. Then we can go on the defensive and gather resources. So, continue throwing people and material into the meat grinder, which from his point of view will still require fighting for another 5 years. After that, there will be nothing left of the material thrown into the meat grinder. And Russia will have to go on the defensive and hope that it can regenerate its forces. The second option is to have gone on the defensive immediately, to dig in underground, and to start destroying enemy personnel and other targets until either the enemy runs out of resources or we run out of personnel and weapons. This option has no time limit. It could drag on indefinitely. At the same time, judging by the trend, the enemy is escalating their attacks on our rear and increasing both the number and the range of their strikes. If time approaches infinity, the personnel losses will be just as high or even higher than in the first scenario. We also see that even on the defensive, he doesn't see a real solution. It would require fewer losses, but at the same time, it wouldn't bring the goal any closer. The Ukrainian efforts in the rear area are acknowledged and described as increasingly dangerous. At the same time, it must of course be clear that the Ukrainians, for their part, can also largely remain on the defensive and thus also suffer fewer losses, because they are no longer even being pressured in their positions. So the second option is also not interesting or attractive for the Russians. The third scenario, he says, is a variation of the first 2 scenarios, in which nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction are used. Here, the risks and our losses are hardly predictable, but we must be aware that every additional day of the special military operation brings the moment closer when the enemy will acquire these weapons of mass destruction, and it is by no means certain that he will not use them immediately. So for Fighter Bomber, weapons of mass destruction are a valid option, but he also doesn't see them as a real solution. It is said that he believes Ukraine will eventually have weapons of mass destruction. That is, nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons itself. Ukraine might then use them immediately. This theory is not very convincing, since a Ukrainian use of weapons of mass destruction would trigger an immediate Russian counterstrike, which, due to the superiority of the Russian arsenal, would not end well for Ukraine. Fighter bomber acknowledges that none of his options make sense. Reports about the capture of villages that are inhabited by no one except for a handful of grandmothers should not obscure the fact that the front has practically come to a standstill. At some point, Russia will have to recognize that the focus must be on preserving its own soldiers. This must be accompanied by maximum damage to enemy soldiers and civilians until they are ready to negotiate. In other words, the enemy, Ukraine. The last 15% of Donbas must be secured diplomatically. Fighter bomber continues. We need to realize that the enemy's situation is much worse than ours, but that he still has enough resilience and resources to keep fighting for several more years, even in his current state. And with increased personnel and military support, it could even be many years. Of course, we lose more every day of the war than Ukraine does. This is followed by propaganda claiming Ukraine isn't a real state, is a foreign puppet, and that its constitution and freedoms are being abolished. Yet Russia faces the same threat. Overall, we see once again that Russia is superior in terms of personnel and equipment. However, in the current phase of the war, it is not able to use this advantage in a way that translates into significant territorial gains. Effectively, Fighter bomber is saying that Russia needs to seek a negotiated solution. If this is also acknowledged by the Russian government, then peace might actually become possible. The only question is, when? So Fighter bomber comes to the conclusion that Russia cannot win. But do you know how Russia could have won? If it had refrained from war and instead invested in stocks. With the DAX and the S&P 500, it could have made 65% gains, and with the Nasdaq, 80% gains. So don't be like Russia and invest instead of waging war. Today's sponsor can help with that. We live in a time when conflicts, elections, central bank decisions, and geopolitical tensions often move the markets almost in real time. You can see that very clearly right now. That's why I think it's important when investing to have a partner who not only enables trading, but also meaningfully combines information with practical ways to act. That's exactly one of the reasons why I find XTB interesting. Through the integrated news section, you can see which developments are moving the markets. And you can make informed decisions from that, instead of just reacting to headlines. But just as important to me is the issue of trust. XTB already supports over 2 million customers with financial matters, and has been in the market for over 20 years. That's especially a point I wouldn't underestimate when it comes to long-term financial decisions. Then, there are the conditions. You can trade up to 100,000 euros per month commission-free across over 9,000 stocks and ETFs. That's really relevant for long-term investors. And right now, new customers even get a free Hugo Boss share until April 30th. Click the link in the video description or scan the QR code. Complete opening your account. Within 7 days after opening your account, accept the terms and conditions in the app and make your first deposit. That way, you've secured your share. Compared to the analysis on Swotky, however, this is still optimistic. Swotky is one of the oldest and most influential pro-Russian military channels. It was created back in 2014 at the beginning of the conflict in Donbas. Among experts, it is considered a central platform for mobilization and information within the pro-Russian spectrum and is closely connected to Igor Girkin. In Swotky, German Zadulayev writes, "The situation at the front is extremely difficult. The enemy has once again gained superiority in low-altitude airspace. The number of enemy drones has increased, and their quality has changed again. Many drones use fiber optic connections. Strike drones have changed their frequencies, are using motherships, and so on. Our electronic warfare is not helping, and even the drone warning devices are not sounding any alarms. The enemy is flying in swarms of several hundred drones, using artificial intelligence. The enemy is currently isolating the front and the entire combat zone. There is no logistical support. Delivering supplies, evacuating the wounded, and carrying out troop rotations are life-threatening tasks. In many sectors, isolation is followed by a drone attack and then an advance. The enemy is recapturing positions. The danger of a large-scale breakthrough cannot be ruled out. Many military personnel say that the enemy is preparing a repeat of the fall of 2022 when we lost huge areas. But this time, the defeat could be even worse. Urgent organizational and technical measures are needed to defend against drones. New solutions. If the generals don't come up with new solutions now, tomorrow it will be too late, even for themselves. What do you think? How much longer will Russia keep trying in vain to seek a decision on the battlefield? Do you think German Sadullayev is exaggerating? Leave a comment. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. That helps with the algorithm. If you're new here, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future videos. That's all from me for now. Thank you for your attention and see you soon. Thanks also to the supporters on Patreon as well as here on YouTube. I would especially like to thank Lieutenant Colonel Mahamori and Lieutenants Bertainment, Robert Veal, Lichtchetre, Anti-X, Meersmann, Malermeister Nagel, and Marcus P. Alex Rosenthal, Mad Best, Vision Soundlab, Zigrider, Silvius Dröver, Möter 1000 Janisgu, Sascha Müller, Cunningham, Oistress, Shadow, Jans vom Eck, Uwe die Fram, Nickname 2Bip, Carsten Schulz, Tequila 42. Thank you very much. Without you, this wouldn't be possible.